what I'm going to do now is talk about the household level research that we were doing as part of the project. I know quite a few of you here are interested in household level research. And there were two reasons for doing it. One was to study the effectiveness of these measures that were being installed. And the second was to actually quantify the carbon impacts and energy impacts, because that is the first obvious question that I got even asked during lunch. Did they reduce energy or carbon? It's very attractive, I think, probably because we can measure it. So we want to, manage it. But anyways, these were the two big reasons for it. So I'm going to take you some of the thematic questions for this strand of work. Show you the impacts on energy use and carbon emission at the local scale, look at effectiveness, and then try and establish some kind of links between the communities and household energy use. Does that make a difference if people are in communities where there is community action happening, and some of the findings. Okay, so again, some of the questions you've seen, so I'm going to rush through them, but essentially talk about carbon impacts, how useful carbon mapping was, effects and impacts of interventions, both technical and behavior change, and how effective are low carbon communities in helping householders change their energy behaviors and reduce energy use. So how did we research this? We actually had a graduated approach. So we started off by looking at the local area, which is slightly bigger, or sometimes quite big, than the local community. And this is using publicly available data sets, lower layer super output area. And the reason was we wanted the methodology to be replicable as well. We then zoomed into the local community, where we agreed with each of the communities that we were working with to study 300 households and carbon map them, essentially to establish the baseline, the current energy use, and the future possibility of reductions. And then we worked for over 2 years with 15 households per community. So approximately 90 we started with, ended with 88. So, I think we were okay there. And we've, worked in quite a bit of detail there. So these are, in terms of, the spatial configuration of the communities. The orange bit is the area that we mapped, and the purple bit are the lower layers, super output areas, which I'm going to call LSOA from here on. So yes, what did we find at the local area level? Because you want to know, what is the carbon reduction? We managed to get longitudinal data from 2008, so the start of 2008 to December 2012, over 5 years. And against the national figures, you can see the change in domestic gas use. So as I said, we focused on household. So we looked at domestic gas use. The first thing to notice is 2 communities were off the gas network, which is why there's an NA there. Now, the 2 bits to notice here is, first, all 4 communities have reduced, 2 of them more than the national average, but most importantly, all 4 had lower baselines to start off with, which means that the potential to reduce becomes less. So if you have a very efficient house, it's difficult to reduce 80% versus from a house which is, Victorian terrace or, whatever. So I think that's quite important, that they started with a lower baseline but still achieved reductions. And also they were in communities of disadvantage, where some of the savings could be taken up by increased warmth. And despite that, savings have happened in the communities. In Blaken, for instance, where there were 21% reductions in gas usage, was they were focusing on energy management and physical improvements, mainly on the demand side. In Kirklees, it was a council-led fuel poverty campaign focusing on PVs and energy display monitors. In terms of electricity use, again, all the communities have had reductions. The reason why Amalavantave has had a little bit of an increase is because most of the houses had heat pumps there. So there was a shift in the fuel. Which doesn't necessarily mean that overall energy use has increased. In terms of electricity use, there's been a reduction across, if you look at the 3 communities, Easter Side, Kirklees, and West Oxford, the reductions are much higher than the national level. And the reason is there was a focus on behavior change, of course, but combine that with supply side. So, PV-driven approach, and that's made a difference. We are not saying that the lower layer super output area is equal to the low carbon community area, but, it is an approach which gives some indication as to what happened. Zooming more into the community level, we found, we used Decorum to do some of the analysis by looking at energy use at a house level and aggregating to a community scale. We were looking at approximately, 1,650 dwellings across the 6 communities. And it covered most of the build forms and age groups. We collected data, using various measures, from maps through questionnaires, and the results are validated with actual data. Now, in terms of Decorum, the thing that it helped the most was it established the baseline prior to community action. So you are able to estimate current energy use, but then take out the measures that were installed and predict what the pre-community action carbon emissions were. And this helps communities in finding out what is the effect of the implemented measures, which is quite important, not just for funding purposes, for their own effectiveness, for actually showing to the wider group and the wider community that this is making, a difference in carbon. And then you can also predict the potential for future carbon savings. So, whatever has, measuring past performance is great, but we also need to look forward. And carbon mapping helped in identifying areas of high energy use for future action, which I think is critical. It also helped in doing detailed evaluation of energy savings, and we used, although we have a house-by-house model for every house, using, for those of you who know, BREEDM 12 model, we also looked at the dominant, archetypes in each community and did detailed analysis and provided advice at community events, which was seen to be quite useful. We also then predicted the, potential for deploying these measures on a mass scale. So, depending upon the house type. And that's quite important for scaling up, for mass retrofits, and for lots of other things as well. And those features were considered to be quite useful. This has been said, this has been recognized internationally, which is good. But in terms of the overall findings, I think carbon mapping helped the communities to also prepare for, things like Green Deal communities. We could estimate, which houses were, able to take Green Deal improvements and at, what cost. It's a powerful engagement tool, and I think mapping becomes even more powerful when you combine it with thermal imaging, whether that's aerial thermal image or on-street thermal image. The useful aspect considered was, the evaluation of improvements. And, for instance, in Kirklees Council, they used the model to justify funding for the PVs. So, for instance, the comment was that carbon mapping will help guide future investment of the community fund towards PV installation. So I think the model can be used in various ways. Oxford and Hook Norton, after the workshops, when we surveyed the participants, most of them seemed to be more motivated and willing to take more action, whether it was in the space heating domain or improving lighting. But I think one of the limitations that we need to recognize for carbon mapping is that it requires expert input. So we've been discussing actually having a light version of it, which can be used by the communities. How it can be linked to publicly available data sets, energy, environment, social data sets, and how can this become then a tool for actually enabling mass retrofits. The third bit of level that we were looking at was working with individual case study households. We deliberately chose to have a case study based approach versus a kind of a control group approach, because we wanted to understand the trends and what happens in houses. So we worked with 88 households, and interestingly, 74 of them are owner-occupier. And that's quite an important point, because most of the research that's happening at the moment tends to focus on social housing and the rented sector. There's very limited research based on 74 owner-occupiers. Some of it is published already, but I think this is an important resource to go forward. The houses had a mix, cavity wall, solid wall, so there wasn't a kind of a bias. The LZTs, we had 21 solar PV systems, quite a few solar thermal and heat pumps as well. And the interventions are, from insulation to improvements in heating systems, generation, as well as behavior change interventions, whether they were, attending workshops or having low carbon living programs like in Oxford, or even having energy display monitors. Our approach has been, graduated in this as well. we wanted to understand the wider impacts by studying the physical environment, the occupants and their interactions. So it's required quite mixed methods approach, which combines remote monitoring with thermal imaging and energy interviews as well. Out of the 88, with 62 which had physical and behavior change interventions, we did in-depth studies, and the other 26 were control and as a light touch. So what happened in terms of energy use? Now I'm going to show you the houses that we studied in terms of electricity use, again over 5 years. So from 2008 start to end of 2012. And there you go, households with physical and behavior change. So it's a small sample, but it says a lot of things, and there's a lot of variability. And when you have a sample which has a lot of variation and polarization, mean is not a good way of doing it. You tend to look at median, which is a better indicator. And households with physical and behavior change had a 12% reduction in their electricity use. Households with physical interventions only had 3% reductions, possibly because some of the houses had heat pumps, which may have actually raised the electricity use. And households with no interventions, and it's only a small sample of 11, but still it is showing some results, had actually had an increase. So without doing anything in those houses, there was some increase, whether you look at the mean or the median there actually. Now if you look at gas use, we had less houses because I said there's, we had few off the gas network houses. Households with physical and behavior change interventions had a 16% reduction. So that's, quite a bit. Households with physical interventions had slightly more, but that was because some of the houses have had, there are individual circumstances where they've had better insulation and they've had, much enhanced fabric improvements. But more or less, there's been, reductions. Again, interestingly, households with no interventions have actually had an increase. So yes, I agree the sample size is small, but it's still indicating some results, which I think are quite important. If we look at now data for 58 of the 62 houses for which we have good quality data, one of the first things you notice, and this is, I'm going to let you stare at it for a minute, it's looking at energy use of the 58 houses. And the first thing you notice is it's highly variable. What is an average? There's a big variation. I'll give you some numbers. Now, the highest user here is 472 kilowatt hours per square meter per year, and the lowest is somebody in Oxford who has 44 kilowatt hours per square meter per year. And the house which has the lowest did not have a major retrofit done. It has a very switched on individual who looks after energy use. And 44 is almost better than, or close to a passive house. So, it's not this, reductions can happen. The mean energy use, just as an indication is 189. So if you compare it against the 2013 average, 35 households had lower energy usage, below 207 kilowatt hours per square meter per year. So certainly something is happening and something is working here. And you can see the distribution. As I said, our approach has been household level. So what we have done as part of the project is produced a household report for every house. I know it's a lot. That's thanks to Laura and others. And we've actually provided those reports to each household. And that will be, mentioned in a presentation forthcoming. Again, in terms of carbon, big variation, but 34 are below the national average. 18 kilograms CO2 is very good. Just to give you an idea, the TSP's or Innovate UK's Retrofit for Future program targeted 17 kilograms CO2 as an 80% reduction target. So there are houses, around that as well here. And these are not major retrofits. These are, some improvement measures, but a combination of them with a lot of community action, behavior change. So yes, something is happening here. Okay, moving on. Let's look at the effectiveness of fabric upgrades. And thermography here was very helpful. And I think thermography does two things. One, it's an engagement tool. So, even if it's not the most accurate and you don't set the camera right, it's okay because it can actually help you in engaging people. And that, I think, is an important function. The other function, which is more technical, is diagnostic. Is to find out whether the intervention that has been made is actually delivering the savings and it's actually done properly or not. And I think it does both things. So we've used it as a diagnostic tool and also for, raising engagement. So you can see some things not unexpected. Uninsulated solid brick walls, you will see. So for those of you who haven't seen thermal imaging, anything that you see as a light, reds, greens is not good from outside. The darker it gets, the better it is. That means less heat loss from the building element. You can see there is a house which has had improvements. I recently saw a report which has actually put one of these images, not ours, but somebody else's, to say this is what 2050 Britain will look like. So if we have all houses, in this shade of blue. So there are, houses which did improve. Some things which, we would stress is areas around windows, eaves. Those things need to be looked into in much more detail. In cavity wall insulation, we discovered that it was mostly patchy. So, and that could be for various reasons, because of the wall construction itself, because maybe the injection points were quite few. But those are things worth looking into, because if the quality isn't good, you're not going to get the savings in reality. Again, there are various things, you can notice, for instance, there's a clear line across the loft on the left-hand side, and there's a dwelling which has a, radiator reflector panel. Which you can notice in the thermal image. So it's an X-ray vision. I would say every community group or every low-carbon community should have access to a thermal imaging camera to be able to raise awareness, because you suddenly have X-ray vision and you make energy visible. And saving something visible is much better than saving something which is invisible. So the other thing we found was we have very good data on solar PV. So this is again another resource that's generated by the project. We have good data for 19 solar PV systems. When I talk about good data, I think I should say over a year, 5-minute data. So, I really mean good quality data here. And interestingly, most of the solar PVs actually work as intended. So the light green bar is what it was expected to generate, and the dark green is what it actually did. And all the dots above or on the line mean good. So it's performing better. And the ones that are not performing that good are not that bad, actually, if you see. And that might be because of local conditions like a tree shading the system or something of that order. But mostly, solar PVs did work in these communities. What's also interesting is we were looking at, what was the self-consumption, because it is no longer just important to have generation. It's also important to know the time of use. So when is it used, not just how much. And we found that it ranged from 15% to 68%. So how much of the PV electricity that's generated is used in the house versus how much that's exported. Because that's very important for smart grids, smart networks, smart appliances. And average is 45%. So we could say some of the assumptions in SAP are fine, which assume 50%. At least we could say that here. The other thing to notice is that usage does not depend on occupancy. So we can't say that just because people are going to be at home, just on, at the evenings and weekends, their energy demand is going to be higher in the evening. Okay, that's fine. This is understandable for this house, which, was occupied in evenings and weekends, and you can see the generation doesn't match with the use. But even for a house which was always occupied, you still have energy uses happening during the evening. Going forward, demand response is a very important area. And I know both universities are involved in projects looking at, energy generation and demand response now. And I think it is critical that the signs that we are observing here of people willing to change their end uses are studied in more detail as a future research area. Looking at air source heat pumps, we had 5 air source heat pumps. I'm not going to attempt to tell you all the bars, but the main thing is that over the 4 months of winter, so this is from Jan to April 2014, follow the black line, which is the coefficient of performance, which tells you how much heat is generated for a unit of electricity going in, and more or less the coefficient of performance was just around 2. So it's doing reasonably okay. One of the things to be careful of with heat pumps is if the temperature outside goes down really low, the coefficient of performance goes down. So the difference between sink and source, the more it increases, the less air source heat pumps become efficient. So we've got some data there. although there are very interesting stories about monitoring of these pumps, so happy to talk to people who are interested. But I think the thing I want to raise here is, if low and zero carbon technologies have to be scaled up, which is what the government policy wants through various initiatives, we have to look at installation and commissioning quality. What shocked me personally was not heat pumps. I was actually almost expecting it. It was solar thermal. Solar thermal systems have been around for 45 years probably now, and still they are not being installed properly. There are problems with glycol mixes. There were issues with the sizing, the pipework not being insulated, and also difficulty in monitoring them. Solar PV system, apart from one or two, I think more or less they were okay, and I would personally promote solar PVs over others. But there are issues in operation and in use. It's not just installation and commissioning. Awareness and knowledge is very mixed. With an air source heat pump, it's about a new technology and old behavior. It's a different way of heating the house. There was lack of feedback available on the performance. So if there's lack of feedback on the generation, then it's very difficult for householders to optimize their behaviors, to have maximized the savings. One of the things that we discovered, which I would probably promote quite strongly, is that monitoring low and zero carbon technologies is neither easy nor cheap. And what my plea would be, that monitoring kit actually needs to be integrated in those systems or installed. When these systems go in, it is very difficult to install these systems. And having done a lot of monitoring before we entered the project, we must have monitored over 100 houses. It was a challenge. Even taking them out is equally a big challenge. And I'm looking at Laura because she's been through some of this in detail. There were also issues with maintenance, and I think that's going forward very important, because if you have monitoring installed, you get feedback on how well it works, and that's critical. In terms of environmental conditions, as I said, this is looking at a subset of the houses on indoor temperatures in winter in the living rooms. More or less, they are between I'm using SAP deliberately here because, that's what people, see as widely understood, 18 to 21 degrees. Apart from a few houses where we found there were issues with bedroom temperatures increasing in summer, which could indicate overheating. More or less, they were stable temperatures. Relative humidity between 40 to 70% mostly. Dwellings with 3 or more physical improvements had average indoor temperatures of 19 degrees, so against a national average of 17.7, that's better. Dwellings with fewer measures still had 18 degrees. Relative humidity was more or less okay. And you can see from the comments, one of the comments, that little front bedroom was very cold and it was getting mold on the wall. So yes, I think the house is generally warmer, although another household had some problems with their insulation. In terms of CO2 levels, and I'm using indoor CO2 levels as a proxy for ventilation and indoor air quality, anything above 1,000 parts per million is probably not considered that great. But these houses have had a mix. Some of them are okay. There are some houses where, because we are also studying the window opening behavior, we know some of those windows are not opened that much because of probably this fear of losing the heat. But the point to make is that if we're going to improve the houses, we don't want to solve one problem at the cost of the other. Ventilation is as critical as insulating houses, and I mean background ventilation. I don't mean opening a window to just that's fine, but you also need regular flow of air coming through. In terms of impacts on behaviors, we did 2 rounds of interviews. So we had this 58, 60 households that we went to in 2012 and repeated it in 2014 to find out about their behaviors. And I'm just quoting 2 here. Closing windows before turning on or up the heating, and putting more clothes on before turning up the heating. And actually overall it's improved and sustained. So we went back after 2 years and there were no significant differences. And you can see some of these quotes here. I'm not going to go through all of them, but after improvements, we didn't need to have the heating on continuously. But there is still big variation in heating profiles. So, normally we say that heating profiles are, you should have a morning load and an evening load, but that's not true. Look at the house here. It's not occupied all day. It's evening and weekend, but the heating is usually on all the time. So it's quite difficult to say that there is one kind of profile or two kinds that are being, and these are quite similar houses. In terms of non-heating related behaviors, which is essentially electricity using behaviors, there were various things we asked, and these are things that are asked in national surveys, so we wanted to replicate that. And again, there's been improvement in both purchasing behaviors, so getting energy efficient appliances, and habitual behaviors over the 2 years. And you can see this comment. One thing we learned from the course was cooking in bulk. We made 18 lasagnas the other day. So it's cooking all in one go. I thought that was really interesting. But again, there's another point to look at. We'll put the washing machine on when it's sunny and try to do these things in series. So that's great. But when it's been sunny, I've thought, it's going to be free, so I'll put them in here. That's the tumble dryer coming online, which wasn't there. So you can have both the situations. So as I said, demand response is going to be important going forward. But again, non-heating related behaviors as well, you can see a big variation. I don't know whether all of you know this, but district network operators usually have one profile of occupancy that they use to size the amount of electricity that is there in a substation. And you can see the amount of profiles we have here. In terms of sustaining behaviors, we found there were quite a few factors that influenced it. It's not, just about personal factors. They are important, personal attitudes and motivations. Financial factors are also important, and I will not read the codes for sake of saving time. Social factors, health and comfort are equally important. There are technological factors and understanding of the systems. There are practical factors, the hassle factor, that's being talked about even for retrofits and taking, undertaking home energy improvements. But then the more important thing we wanted to find out was what is the role of low carbon communities in reducing household energy use. And 43 out of the 48 felt that the support or advice from the low carbon community has helped them in reducing their household energy use. It has enabled them to change behaviors by funding the measures, facilitating the installation, increasing the knowledge and awareness, increasing the motivation and agency to undertake further improvements. So it's not just the energy and carbon or the improvement in environmental conditions. It's also increasing the know-how and motivation and agency to take action. But I think this is my favorite comment, and I want to pause here for a second because I think it's worth reading. I think I probably would have done it all anyway, but maybe not as quick and maybe not as effectively with the extra things I learned. I think that sums it up really well in terms of the association between the communities and household energy use. So before I end, just the last slide on summarizing the findings from the household level research. As I said, at the local area level, all communities have had energy reduction from 2008 to 2012. It has been because of other factors, but the thing to note is they had low baseline figures, and still reductions have been significant. And they are 4 were communities of disadvantage. Carbon mapping seemed to be a useful approach for bottom-up house-by-house analysis. Physical intervention and behavior change interventions have achieved reductions in electricity and gas use. Solar PVs worked particularly well. There were issues with other systems. Retrofitting monitoring kit, as I said, is important. There were more stable and warmer indoor temperatures. Some risk of overheating, but I think we need to look at it in more detail. But it's important. Intervention had significant impacts on energy-related behaviors, both one-off and habitual. And I think overall, before I end, low-carbon community-led home energy improvements have been effective, we would conclude. So I think I'm going to probably stop here and open it up for questions, if that's okay. Yeah.